freedom of speech,
fundamental rights,
freedom of conscience,
academic freedom,
freedom of press,
and the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Okay, welcome back to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, where every other week we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. I am your host, as always, Nico Perino, and this week we're speaking with Techdirt founder and editor Mike Masnick. Techdirt is a group blog that covers technology and its intersection with government policy, consumer rights, and civil liberties, including the freedom of speech. Indeed, if you visit techdirt.com, you will notice that free speech is its own menu item at the top of the website. Techdirt has developed a reputation of sorts as a go-to source for news and analysis about the free speech implications of modern technology and for modern tech companies. That focus on free speech stems in no small part to Mike Masnick. Mike founded Techdirt in 1997, and since then, he has authored nearly 50,000 blog posts. His writings on free speech have shaped the narrative surrounding free speech controversies, such as when he coined the phrase the Streisand Effect to describe what happens when efforts to censor backfire and create greater awareness for material trying to be censored. In today's conversation with Mike, we discuss some of the issues he's recently written about for Techdirt, including defamation lawsuits and content moderation. But I also ask Mike about the founding of Techdirt, the culture for free speech in Silicon Valley, the fears surrounding new technologies, and of course, the story behind the Streisand Effect. Here is Techdirt founder and editor Mike Masnick. Mike Masnick, thanks for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
So you founded Techdirt in 1997, is that right?
Yes, it depends on your definition of founded, but sure. I started something that became Techdirt in 1997.
And since then, I've seen you've written like 50,000 blog posts. Many of those are about free speech. Was free speech always a topic of conversation or a topic you wanted to cover on Techdirt?
I don't know if it was always a topic. I mean, I think it was always important to me. Free speech has been something that I've been interested in for a very, very long time. Going back to, and I was reminded of this recently in high school, and I can't remember exactly which grade in high school I was. I was part of a group of folks who produced an underground newspaper, which, you know, I chuckle now in retrospect. It sounds so cheesy that we thought that was cool at the time. But my job in the very first issue of the underground newspaper was to actually explain to anyone reading it why us producing and distributing an underground newspaper at the high school was legal. And so I went on a deep exploration of early free speech cases and things like Tinker versus Des Moines and stories like that, and wrote up this whole, you know, legal analysis when I was, you know, however old, 16 years old, on free speech in high schools. And so I've always been sort of interested in the subject. Techdirt itself wasn't initially supposed to be focused on those things. It was just focused on kind of innovation and technology, obviously, and business and business models and things like that. But, you know, the more I was writing about it and the more I was interested in this stuff, these things all started to converge. I was writing a lot about intellectual property early on, and that kept sort of bumping up against free speech questions. And then a bunch of other topics would come in, and you know, writing about the internet certainly quite a bit. And there are all sorts of free speech questions that come up when you talk about the internet. And so free speech has always sort of been there, but I didn't necessarily think of it as a focus early on, but certainly within a few years, it became a pretty key topic on the site. Yeah,
now if you go to techdirt.com, free speech is one of the 5 tabs at the top of the website.
Yeah. Well, it's one that certainly has become a central theme, and I think really important. I think it touches on all of the other stuff that we talk about. And you know, I've explained this before to people that I think that, you know, what really drives me at a core is sort of interest in innovation, but I actually think free speech and innovation tie together, and they're really, really important, and that you don't get the same kinds of innovation without free speech as you do with, and they sort of go together in the other way too, where I think innovation helps create opportunities for there to be more expression and more speech as well.
Well, you'd think in Silicon Valley, where innovation is so important, that you'd also have strong support for free speech principles. Is that something you find? Because those of us who live on the East Coast, we think of Silicon Valley as being maybe more progressive than Middle America or the East Coast, and consonant with that is, the progressive or skepticism of free speech that we've seen on display recently, especially on college campuses.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say that's true. I mean, you're talking about many millions of people, and so obviously lots of people have very different viewpoints and different stances on things. It's funny, Silicon Valley. It is, I think, a little hard to classify. It certainly votes progressive Democratic candidates usually, but also we have a very sort of strong, what people refer to as libertarian streak in terms of how people view things. And so I think Silicon Valley is actually pretty strongly, free speech focused, but again, we're talking about a huge generalization, but you look at the companies and sort of where they came from, and, the people who work at these companies who are making some of these decisions really are steeped in sort of, historical free speech principles, or, you have people who, there's a lot of people I know who work at tech companies who, came out of the ACLU, for example, and, have very strong free speech principles and bring that into the companies that they work for. And so, I mean, the now it's sort of joked about, but the line that, Twitter is the free speech wing of the free speech party, I was just going to bring that up. That's a very real feeling out here. And I think a lot of people do believe very strongly in free speech from, just as a concept.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that they see is the issues that Twitter and Facebook and YouTube have had with content moderation and choosing what is allowed and what is not allowed on the platform. And the focus is on what is not allowed on the platform, which is characterized as a form of censorship. And I guess you could probably describe it that way. But that you see it in that case as being kind of in opposition to general free speech principles. And on the one hand, they are platforms and they have the editorial right to allow whatever they want to allow on their platform. But then you have lawmakers on Capitol Hill who are lambasting the Twitter CEO for what they perceive as conservative bias.
Right.
So I think that's the kind of the conception that people in popular America have.
Yeah, well, I think it's a lot trickier and a lot more nuanced than that, and I think that's part of the problem, right? So you do have different competing interests here, and certainly, like if we're talking about free speech, the platforms themselves have free speech rights in terms of determining who they allow on their platforms and not their private platforms.
Just like you at Techdirt can allow whoever you want to write for Techdirt.
Exactly.
To write for Techdirt and can not publish whatever you don't want to publish.
Right. And so you have choices about that, and normally we support that kind of free speech as well. Where it becomes tricky, and I certainly early on, came at a lot of this from the perspective of, this platform should take a totally hands-off approach. But even the more that I've thought about and had these conversations, you begin to realize that is a lot trickier of an equation than people seem to think it is. If you haven't managed any sort of community, frankly, you begin to realize, like, if you have a totally open site and a totally open community, what happens? It very, very quickly gets filled up with spam and all sorts of other junk, right? And so, like, one of the first things, on Techdirt itself, like, we have a commenting system, and, early on my stance was, well, we should never delete any comment no matter what. And then, of course, you start getting all this comment spam. You're like, oh, wait, okay. That's not really good. That's not good for the community. It's not what anyone wants to see. So we can probably delete that. And then you're like, okay, well, now I actually do feel that content moderation is okay. So now I suddenly have to draw lines in terms of, well, what is okay and what is not okay. And then you suddenly open up a huge host of very difficult questions. And so it is a really, really tricky issue. And it's, what's interesting and what I think is missed by a lot of people who don't interact with the people at these companies who are trying to make all of these calls is it is kind of amazing how many of them come from this sort of very strong pro free speech background. And in fact, I'm not going to name who, but someone at one of these companies recently commented to me something to the effect of, what a lot of people don't realize is they're criticizing all these companies and their content moderation decisions is how many of the lawyers and policy people at these companies who are making these decisions were people who, otherwise speaking, probably would have gone to work for the ACLU or EFF or some other organization that is strongly pro-free speech. And they are at these companies really trying to come up with policies and plans that are protective of free expression as much as possible, with the recognition that, no matter what you do, there are trade-offs. Do you allow all sorts of spam or not? And then once you've said that, do you allow people to be harassed and threatened? Well, then you have to start dealing with that. And so there are all of these things, and so many of the cases are a lot more gray than black and white. And it's easy to sort of pick out one or two cases and say, well, I would have decided differently. But it's hard. It's much harder in practice. And just as an example of that, we did this event that we ran in Washington, D.C. last year at a conference on content moderation. And the event was, we basically turned the entire audience into content moderators. And we sort of had a fictional social network and a whole bunch of examples of flagged content and made up terms of service in terms of like, this content was flagged and someone said it violates this particular rule. And it was, lightly fictionalized, and some of the examples were based loosely on real life examples. And we asked the audience, what would you do about this content if you were a content moderator? And we gave people 4 choices. So one was just do nothing, leave it up. One was take it down. One was put some sort of flag on it. So basically like, a warning sign, this might be adult material or whatever, some sort of flag that would indicate to readers they could still see it, but there's some sort of warning sign associated with it. And then the last one was escalate, which is basically, this is above my pay level. This is too difficult to determine. And we went through 8 different examples. And what was amazing was, out of an audience of about 100 people took part in the system. We just had them vote on their mobile phones. Was that with every single example, at least someone in the audience chose each of the 4 different options. And so, it really highlighted, to me at least, and hopefully to people in the audience, like, these are not easy decisions. There's no clear answer, even in cases where some people think this is obviously, of course you should leave this content up, and of course you should always allow this, or of course you should take this down. There's always someone who disagrees. And it sort of highlights how difficult that question is. And again, I am coming at this from a, I am a true believer in free speech, First Amendment principles, and supporting as much expression as possible. And I believe strongly in these ideas of free speech and the market of ideas. And if someone is spouting something stupid, the best way to deal with it is more speech and things like that. But I also recognize that there are real challenges to managing content on a platform and keeping that platform, viable as a platform for people to use. And so it creates really, really difficult choices. And so I know the sort of public perception that's out there, but I think it's important to sort of push back a little bit on the idea that these companies are out there censoring people. I think they're making very difficult decisions, often trying to think through all the options. I think they could do a lot better job with transparency about how they're making these decisions. I think they could do a lot better job of having a clear due process and appeals process for how this stuff works. I think they could do a much better job of clarifying what the rules are in situations in which there may be problems. But contrary to the belief that's out there, these are not people who are going to work and saying, who can we censor today? I think it's very much the reverse of that.
Well, I think they're going to work and trying to run a business. This isn't the town square. This isn't run by the government. I remember when MySpace first came out, and I was, kind of taken aback, maybe not taken aback because there was nothing to compare it to, but I was amazed by how much you could manipulate your profile. on MySpace. Like if you knew a little bit of HTML, you could make the background black. You could put a strobe light in there if you want. You could have memes up and down, and it would take a minute to load the entire page. And for me, after a while, it just seemed to get annoying, and I didn't really want to use the platform anymore. Right. And now, on the one hand, MySpace gave us a lot of freedom, but on the other hand, that amount of freedom kind of turned me off from this community, from this platform. And I just think about now, what if free speech, or what if Facebook allowed for First Amendment free speech protections on its platform, and you could post pornography on the platform, or we know what the Supreme Court says about crush videos, right? For example, I don't know that I would want to go to Facebook every day. So when you manage something, you have to take the trade-offs more seriously than you do if you're just Monday morning quarterbacking. And anyone who's ever run a business or run a department or had employees or needed to create a viable business or organization kind of knows how difficult those trade-offs can be. Yeah. And I think it's a real challenge. And I think, what we should encourage, though, is the opportunity for anyone else to create different communities, and they could be specialized communities. If they are, if we're talking about content that is, maybe some people really don't like or are unlikely to like, or things like that. I'm not against there being a specialized community, where people can discuss those things. I mean, obviously within legal limits, but that doesn't have to be on the platform that then shares that content with everybody else in the world, right? So there are different aspects to this, and part of it is this question of should everything be exposed equally to everyone, right? It's one thing to have the right to speak, and being able to speak is important, and the right to anyone to be able to set up a soapbox in the corner of the public square and speak out, I think is great. But that doesn't mean everyone should be forced to stand next to the soapbox and listen to someone with a bunch of crazy ideas, right? I mean, if you want to be able to walk away from them, you should be able to walk away from them. And the way social media is set up these days, it's sometimes tricky to actually do that. And so that's part of what plays into this as well. Yeah, well, I think one of the issues that places like Facebook and Twitter have is that on the one hand, they're saying they aren't the town square, but then in reaction to some of the meddling from foreign actors that we've seen, they're kind of recognizing that they are, and they have a lot of power in the political discourse and are implementing policies that are reflective of this new view of themselves as the town square. So it becomes harder to make that we're not a town square, we're not the megaphone for democracy argument that you would like to make if you are moderating content when you kind of need that justification to do what they're doing in police. Sure. I mean, it's something totally different, right? It's something totally new, right? I mean, so I think it's tough to make the comparison and say they are a town square and they're not, because they both are and are not, right? It's something totally different, and it's a different thing. And one of the things that's happening right now is we're in the midst of this new thing existing, and people not being used to it, or not being adjusted to it or adapted to it. And I actually think that, like many situations where people sort of freak out about the new thing and the negative consequences of the new thing, and lots of new things come up with negative consequences, over time as a society, we actually do a pretty good job adapting to the new things and understanding the negative consequences and figuring out ways as a society to minimize the negative consequences and to promote the beneficial side of these things. And I think that we're at that in that middle point that everyone seems to forget about, in which we're learning all of that and we're figuring out as a society how to adapt. And at some point in the hopefully relatively near future, we will figure out how to adapt as a society, and it's not necessarily dependent on the platforms getting regulated to hell or whatever, but we as a society will figure out how do we deal with that there is content that we don't necessarily want on these platforms, and how can we adjust to that. And then we'll look back on this and it'll sort of seem like a moral panic that everyone got all up in arms over, that probably wasn't worth it in the long run. But those things take time. And as that process is happening, it's difficult because it's not clear what the answer is. In retrospect, it'll probably be obvious, but right now it's not. Well, I kind of cut you off earlier when you were talking about the history of Techdirt. So we look back on 1997 and you're talking about, and I'm talking about kind of the fears that we have surrounding these new things today in 2019. back when you started Techdirt in '97, what were the new things then? And did you have were there like similar fears or different fears that existed back then that kind of went by the wayside as these technologies progressed?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and they're all different things. I'm trying to think of which one is the best example for that. But like, early on, certainly one of the big issues was around copyright and music online. And so, 97, 98. Napster, exactly. Napster was a big thing. And suddenly there was this talk that, it was going to destroy the music industry, right? And we've basically spent the past 20 years going through this battle of, music on the internet going to destroy it. And it is sort of an interesting lesson in that if you look at kind of the history of what happened, which is the record labels for the most part fought Napster viciously, and it was an attack on everything near and dear to their hearts, and was going to destroy everything, with the one exception of BMG at the time, which was one of the major record labels before it got swallowed up by another one. They actually invested in Napster. Everyone forgets this now. And we're the one label that was supportive of Napster. And then like the people really flipped out at BMG, and they kicked out the CEO, and there was a big lawsuit over it as a huge mess. But everyone was saying, Napster's going to kill everything. And so then they fought that. And then everyone was trying to create like a legalized, a legal music service, and the labels fought that. And for a while, they were just against music on the internet in any way, shape, or form. And then, to sort of appease people, they created their own services. There were Press Play and Music Now were the two services that the labels created, and they were awful, and they were just it was this mess, and they're like, look, we're adapting, and everyone's like, no, we don't want you to adapt that way because it sucks, and it's much easier to just use whatever was post Napster at that point. And then finally you started to get things to change, where Apple sort of mainly Steve Jobs sort of twisted a bunch of arms and convinced the labels to understand stuff and release music. And now, of course, we have Spotify and other streaming services, and the whole market has changed. And, you now look, and, just recently the RIAA, the trade association for the record labels, put out their latest numbers showing that music is making more money than ever, and most of it is coming from streaming, which was the thing that they fought kicking and screaming for 15 of the past 20 years, and now it's making them more money than ever. And you see that whole thing where it's like, in 1997 and 98, if they had just been willing to sort of embrace this technology, understand it, learn how it works, and create something that would have been much easier and got people excited. I skipped the whole part in the middle there where the record label started suing a bunch of music fans. I think they ended up suing about 30,000 people for downloading music, and they lost a whole bunch of money on those lawsuits. They won some of the lawsuits, but they didn't make any money from it. And it certainly didn't endear people to the record labels or make people want to spend money on music. What made people want to spend money on music was really cool, simple to use, convenient services that had everything, like a Spotify or now an Apple Music. It was the innovation that allowed people to enjoy it, rather than going crazy and suing everyone and fighting the innovation in technology. And it's another example of given time to sort of figure these things out and not sued into oblivion. The innovation kind of won out and created a world that's much better. Frankly, now the fact that I can open up Spotify and basically listen to whatever I want. I might have some nostalgic regret for not being able to go to a record store and search through the different stacks to find that one CD I've been dying for, and couldn't find anywhere else, which has sort of a fun element to it. But it's from a general perspective, the ability to open up an app and pull up whatever song I want that's ever been created in the world, for the most part, like that is pretty amazing, and is a great experience overall. And so, the more that we allow the innovation to occur, the more we create these amazing situations. But one thing that we see is that innovation upsets a lot of apple carts, and a lot of people get upset and people freak out, and they come up with all sorts of stories about how the industry is going to die, or this is going to create all sorts of other problems. And everyone focuses on the negative and the negative consequences of this innovation, and they fail to recognize the potential opportunities and new things that might result from it.
Well, I recall in the 90s, there was just kind of a general debate about the internet too, with the passage of the Communications Decency Act.
Yeah.
And I was listening to a speech that Nadine Strawson, who was the former president of the ACLU in the 90s, was giving. She was giving it at the Newseum. And she was telling us about how hard it was to fight for internet freedom in the 90s when you had Time magazine on July 3rd of 1995, for example, on its cover. And people today kind of forget that Time magazine. Well, no, but Time magazine had this huge cultural draw and pull, and it was very influential. And on this particular cover, and if you just kind of Google Time magazine 1995 cyber porn, they had on the cover a child, kind of a shadowy child, a light overhead. His hands are on a keyboard and he's looking out at you like he's looking at the computer screen. And the cover reads cyber porn exclusive. A new study shows how pervasive and wild it really is. Can we protect our kids and free speech? And then in 1999, they had another cover, growing up online. Today's kids dwell in a world of computers and video games. Here's how parents can help them make the right choices. So there was just this fear of the internet in general. And one can imagine a world were it not for these internet freedom activists, in which the internet would be very different today. It would be a very different medium. And me, as I'm 29 years old, I'm relatively young, I don't remember these debates, seeing these conversations and seeing these covers, thinking, holy cow, were they wrong? You know, was the scaremongering wrong?
That, I mean, the first one that you talked about, the cyber porn one, the new report, which is sometimes referred to as the RIM report, was it was completely bogus, right? I mean, what came out later was that the report was a joke. I forget. There were all sorts of problems with the methodology. It was not a peer-reviewed report. It was just this. It was basically like this random, project by someone who was, I forget the exact details, but basically the entire report was debunked, and yet it was a cover story in Time magazine that drove a lot of the debate that helped bring about the original Communications Decency Act, which, the history there, if you don't know, it was like the entire Communications Decency Act was basically just this pure censorship bill. I mean, it was basically saying that every internet service provider had to, stop any porn from appearing on the internet. And that got thrown out as being completely unconstitutional. There was a whole legal dispute over it. And the only part of the Communications Decency Act that survived was Section 230 of the CDA, which is now, being fought over. But that was the part that created protections for platforms, basically saying if somebody uploads some illegal material, then it's not the liability of the platform, it's the liability of whoever uploaded it, which is a really important setup for protecting free speech, right? I mean, so like that section of CDA, the only part that survived the constitutional challenge, came about because of an important lawsuit, which was this Stratton Oakmont versus Prodigy. Stratton Oakmont was this firm which, many years later was immortalized in the Wolf of Wall Street movie about it being this sort of, boiler room scam operation. And back in the 90s on a Prodigy message board, someone had expressed an opinion about Stratton Oakmont that was very negative. And I forget even what the messages were. But the firm, which again did later turn out to be kind of scammy and people went to jail and there's the whole movie about it, but they sued Prodigy, the message board operator, for these messages that were critical of Stratton Oakmont. And the court in New York sided with Stratton Oakmont with the very somewhat bizarre reasoning that because Prodigy did some moderation, this gets back to the content moderation question, because they did some moderation on their message boards, that meant they were accepting liability for anything that they left up. They're basically saying, if you moderate, then you are accepting responsibility. And so if you miss something that is, say, defamatory, then you are now responsible for it and you can be legally liable for it. And that's crazy when you think about it from any perspective, anyone running any site that would allow any user-generated content. I mean, we couldn't have comments under such a setup because we would have to review every comment. If we let through any comment that had defamatory content or something else, then suddenly we would be liable for it. And so
unless right, you did no content moderation. So you could either do no content moderation and let that defamatory comment go up with every other defamatory comment.
Right.
But if you did some content moderation and you took down one post here or another post here, but you let that allegedly defamatory comment stay up, then you are liable.
Right. And then you're back to the thing where, and if you don't do any content moderation at all, you get filled with spam and the thing becomes useless. Right. And so, it became this impossible situation. So, people realized, and Congressman Chris Cox was sort of the leader on this, sort of reading about the Stratton Oakmont case, and basically said this will kill the internet, right? I mean, it'll kill the open nature of the internet and the free speech part of the internet. The fact that you can have these forums and you can have message boards and you can have comments and all of that kind of stuff. You need to be able to allow the companies to manage those things without being liable. And so, he was sort of the original crafter of what became Section 230, and it was to enable free speech online, to enable the platforms to open themselves up and say, if we have to do some content moderation to remove spam or remove offensive content or remove abuse, we shouldn't be liable for that. And therefore it will enable them to actually, offer up those services that enable all of this free speech online. And that's why I find it a little bit disturbing that a lot of the people who are now angry at the platforms and who feel that like they're perhaps biased in their content moderation choices, that they're attacking Section 230 and saying like the way to fix this is to change Section 230 and to make the companies liable again, which will do the exact opposite of what they think it will. Because again, it puts you in that position of either, under that condition, you don't want to do any moderation at all, and then you just get this totally awful crap, or you shut down anything that's user generated in the first place, and you take away the places where free speech can thrive.
How do these companies deal with content moderation? So they decide they're going to moderate content, but you're talking about Facebook, which has millions, if not billions of users at this point. Presumably there's a lot of spam that's going up. Presumably there's a lot of unsavory or unsympathetic expression that's put up on Facebook. How do you deal with it? I realize there's been some reporting about it. A lot of it's done with AI, but AI is not going to detect satire, for example, or it's not going to be good at detecting satire. So how are these tech companies dealing with that?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, a lot of humans are not good at detecting satire either, which is part of the problem.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you outsource it abroad, where labor is often cheaper, comedy does not cross borders well. And satire as a particular brand of comedy does not cross borders well. So if you have someone, for example, in Australia or India or Pakistan moderating content in the United States, especially comedic content, you can't be confident that they're going to be moderating that content correctly.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, the answer is frankly that nobody does it well for the most part is part of the problem. But and so there are a number of different issues here. And so part of it is that one, the companies all do it pretty badly. But in the last few years, they've put a lot more focus on this because it's become more and more important for them to figure out. And for the large companies at least, it is generally this mix of really three things. And most people focus on two of them, but it's really three different things. One is improved, algorithmic monitoring, which is sometimes referred to as AI, which might be generous to describing the tools that are used. The sort of trying to flag content, often, certain dirty words, will put some sort of flag to be reviewed. The second is exactly what you said, a bunch of human beings, often overseas. You mentioned a bunch of countries, but the one that is probably most prominent in this is the Philippines. There's like an entire industry in the Philippines of content moderators who just go into, office buildings in Manila and are constantly clicking on Facebook content and saying allowed, not allowed, allowed, not allowed. But the third element of it is user reporting. A lot of it is if somebody sees some content that they think violates Facebook's rules, they click to report, or Twitter's rules, or YouTube's rules, or whatever, they click a report, and some threshold of clicking leads it to be escalated to a human review or an AI review or some combination thereof. And people review this stuff, and it is, it's still an impossible problem because of all the reasons that you said. Like, AI doesn't determine what is satire or parody or fair use, if we're talking about the copyright context. And human beings aren't necessarily so good at that either. And we've had problems with our content being removed a few times. We have, people are trying to take down our content with either DMCA takedowns. Usually these days, people are sending takedown notices to like Google, and we've had people who have been my favorite one, and this happens more often than you would believe, is people who were criminally convicted, often in Europe, who then use some of the laws in Europe to try and remove our articles from Google search, so that people search on their name. The fact that they were convicted of a crime no longer shows up in Google.
And what's the vehicle for that? The right to be forgotten?
Yeah, it was originally, there was a ruling about this concept of the right to be forgotten, and then it was sort of made more official in the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, which went into effect last May of 2018. And again, like, there are ideas here that make sense, and again, it was sort of a response to big companies not necessarily doing a very good job of respecting people's privacy and how your data was used, right? And so that is potentially a problem, and you can see why people are annoyed by that. But the rules that Europe set in place were, well-meaning, and people were thinking, like, how can we, give more control to end users of their data, which is something I support and I think is good. But it included this right to be forgotten, and the concept, again, like, from a 10,000 foot view, it sounds like it makes sense. So it says, like, if there's a company that has private data on you, you are allowed to request access to that data to see what data they hold on you, and you can request that they forget it. And in the setup of, say, a data broker that is collecting all sorts of information about you, you can understand why that might make sense. You don't want some company that has collected all different things about, like, all of your historical purchases, and they're building a profile on you. You want to be able to allow individuals maybe to go in and say, I don't want you to make this profile of me that's creepy and scary, and so I want to be able to ask you to delete it. But it's been interpreted in a way that includes, like, the data that Google collects on you in order to return results about you on a search. So if I search on, your name and you committed a crime, I kind of feel like it should be, one of the things that turns up would be articles about the fact that you were committed, you committed a crime and were convicted of it. That feels like supportive of free speech. But under the GDPR, it's sort of been determined that, there is, like, this sort of newsworthy relevance exception, but is not very clear and not well enforced. And to avoid facing huge fines, it appears that Google is pretty quick to remove things. We have one case where we had written about someone using this process to get an article from the New York Times removed about the fact that he was convicted of a crime. And then we wrote about that, and then that person appears to have sent a right to be forgotten request to Google to remove our article about that. And then we wrote another article that didn't even mention the guy's crime, because we could say, okay, if you argue, and I find this silly, but if you argue that, the guy did his time, the fact that he committed a crime 12, 15 years ago, that should be forgotten. Like, our article about the fact that he's using this GDPR process to delete an article about his crime, that's something new. That's something that's newsworthy. That should be allowed. But no, like, Google took that out of the index also. And then so we wrote another article about it, and that one went. And so we've gotten this process where, like, every few months, this guy sends another right to be forgotten request. Google removes our old stories about him. And then we feel like we need to write a new one talking about him abusing this process. And it's this weird sort of cat and mouse situation. But you have this.
Well, that's the big threat to democracy, right? I mean, this idea that you need to use a specific example to talk about the excesses of this law, but you can't even use that example to talk about the excesses of that law. So you can never talk about the excesses of the law except in the abstract, which anyone who's ever written an article knows doesn't play well on the internet and doesn't resonate with people the same way that an example does or a real story does.
Exactly. And like, to be clear, like I am sympathetic to the story of, someone maybe messed up, right? You as like a kid, you committed a crime and, you were convicted and you did your time, and you don't want that following you around the rest of your life. Like I understand that, and I am sympathetic to that. But the idea that you can just delete that history from the world feels a little bit like we're going too far,
Yeah, it feels like dropping things down the memory hole.
Yeah.
I mean, most people who commit a crime, especially violent crimes, those things are newsworthy.
Yeah.
And if it happens in a small community, it's going to be reported on in that small community. It might be reported on in the New York Times if it's significant enough. And I don't know that I'd ever want a law that would prevent the reporting on these important newsworthy events.
Right. I mean, there's a freedom of press, freedom of speech concept right there, and I think there are other ways to approach it. Like if you have truly rehabilitated yourself and you serve your time and you've now become a productive member of society, like that is a story too, right? I mean, tell that story, right? Tell about, I messed up when I was, 19, 20, whatever. And I did my time and I learned my lesson and now I've changed my ways and that's a good story. And you can tell that story. And then the fact that you committed a crime 15 years ago, like, no big deal, right? I mean, you sort of explain what that is and people can understand that, but they also can learn about how you changed and grew and became a better person. And to me, that's a lot more compelling story than like, I want to delete the knowledge of the fact that I did commit a crime and was convicted of it.
Yeah, the idea that because you've served your time, you could go back into the New York Times' archives and delete any story written about you seems like it doesn't pass the free society test for
I'm
me.
completely with you. It's a very European notion. I mean, the U.S. doesn't have that, though. There have been, some people have talked about, adding that here, and there are currently debates about, privacy regulations in the U.S. and sometimes are referred to as a American GDPR, and here in California we have this slightly crazy privacy law that has been passed, and there it was sort of written and passed in like 2 weeks. It was this sort of crazy situation that has all these problematic elements to it, and there's an effort to create a US based one that would preempt the California one, and those have problems with them. And so it is possible that we'll end up getting that kind of thing here, though I don't think it would survive First Amendment scrutiny in a court. But these things have impact, and again, like I do want to be clear that the people who are coming up with these laws are well-meaning, right? And they are addressing things that they see as problems. And there is this element that some people have that the people passing these laws or making these decisions are, just outright evil and, just trying to crack down on free speech in every way possible. That is not an accurate statement, I think. I think it's...
Well, I mean, how many laws are ever passed with bad intentions? I imagine some, but most acts of censorship are done because they're weighing things in the balance and they come out on the side that is not the free speech side. So when we look at speech codes on college campuses and they write overbroad and invasive and restrictive internet usage policies, they're not doing so because they want to be the censor. They're doing so because they're looking for some narrow way to prevent one thing that happened before perhaps from happening again. And, so I never try and look at this as someone's acting from the worst intentions, but at the same time, it's not even just deleting criminal history. Didn't I hear a story a couple of years ago about a pianist who put on a performance in Europe and someone wrote a bad review of it and he petitioned to get it taken down and he was successful? So now are we talking about bad reviews can be deleted from the internet because it might compromise your ability to earn money as a pianist?
And I wrote about that, but I'm forgetting who exactly it was. But I do remember writing about that case where he was very angry about this negative review and used use the right to be forgotten to get it deleted. And, and you just get more and more of those cases where, and this is something that I have to sort of, tell people over and over again, is like, if you do provide a tool like that is designed to be used to take down bad content, however you want to define bad, and I recognize it's a loaded term and everything like that, like it will be used and abused, to take down content that people want. We see this in countries all over the world that are now passing, like what they refer to as cybersecurity laws or, hate speech laws that are almost always used to like stop critics of the government or, people who are criticizing the police for abuse. And then, they're brought up on charges of hate speech, hate speech against the police or hate speech against the government. Or
you see this in France with criticism of Israel.
Yeah. Same thing. And there are a variety of situations like that where, and again, like, you can see the legitimate thinking behind the law, but what you don't get is enough people thinking through the actual impact of the law and the actual impact of how these things will be used over time. And I think that should be a big concern. And it's just not.
So speaking of taking down content, I kind of need to ask you about Barbara Streisand, because if you go to your Wikipedia page, it says you were the one that came up with the phrase the Streisand Effect. And so tell me a little bit about the background of that story.
Yeah, so this is a great one, right? So the overall background was that there was this guy, and I should remember it, but I'm blanking on his name, who decided that he was going to basically document coastal erosion on the west coast of the United States. And he had rented or borrowed a helicopter or something and basically flew up and down the entire west coast of the United States and was taking photographs and wanted to photograph literally the entire coast from, the southern part of California up to the northern part of Washington, and then put them all online. And you could go along, and this is in the early 2000s, I want to say, I forget the exact date, and still very early on in the web history. It was not a particularly user-friendly website. It was not like anything that you would see today. It was just sort of static images, and it was sort of difficult to go from one to the next and everything like that. But you could see the entire, this is the days before satellite imagery was easy to access.
You didn't have Google
Earth, and and all that kind of stuff. And his idea was every few years he would go back and do it again, and you could see how the coast would change. All that's great. But it turns out that Barbara Streisand has a, coastal mansion somewhere in Southern California, and somehow, heard about this site, and either her or more likely her lawyers realized that one of the images included an aerial shot of Barbara Streisand's mansion on the coast, and decided that this was somehow illegal and sued the photographer. I think the amount that she sued for was $50 million for posting this photograph. And so the amazing thing that came out, because then, there's a lawsuit is filed, that's public information. And so the Associated Press picked up on the story and wrote about Barbara Streisand suing this photographer. And what came out during the lawsuit was, before the lawsuit was filed, and really before the Associated Press wrote about it, that particular image that shows Barbara Streisand's coastal mansion, I think it had definitely gotten single-digit visits. I think it was either 7 or 9 total visits. And it turned out 2 of them were from Barbara Streisand's lawyers. So that means, somewhere between 5 and 7 other people had seen the image of her mansion.
And probably weren't going to the website to see her mansion in the first place, but just happened to...
And we're going and probably didn't even realize it was her mansion. They're just looking along the coast and all this kind of stuff. And of course, like the day that the Associated Press story came out, that particular image was seen 500,000 times. And this is the early 2000s. If it had happened today, it would have been, many millions, of views. And suddenly, like, this image that she supposedly didn't want and was so important that she didn't want anyone to see it, that she had to sue for $50 million over it, got so much more attention. And so, we wrote a post sort of just, kind of making fun of that result, the fact that all of this kind of stuff happened. And then sort of, we referred back to it a few times. And then a few years later, there was a similar situation. We'd seen this a bunch, that these kinds of things kept happening. We had seen a similar situation where somebody had demanded something be taken down and it got all this attention. And I jokingly said at the end of that post, like, oh, we should have a name for when this happens, when somebody tries to take down content that they don't want anyone to see, and all that does is lead millions more people to go and search it out and find it. And then I just said, let's call that the Streisand Effect, and linked back to that original story about the lawsuit with Barbra Streisand. And somehow, and to this day, I still have no idea how that caught on. And I don't know why, and I don't know how. I had mentioned it a few times on Techdirt, and we were and still are, not a huge site. We have a decent following, but I wouldn't say we're particularly large. And actually, at the time we wrote that, we were even much smaller than we are today. And I probably mentioned it a few more times. A couple other people mentioned it. And then a few years later, suddenly it got mentioned in, I think, Forbes magazine, and that picked it up. And then NPR's Morning Edition did a story about it, and had me on the radio. And then suddenly it was everywhere, and the Streisand Effect just became this thing that now is sort of well known in popular culture, which I still don't fully understand how, but I think it's a really useful concept to understand when you're talking about free speech and trying to suppress speech. And I think that now there are at least some lawyers who recognize that trying to suppress certain types of speech will only lead to it getting more attention, and they maybe think twice about sending the completely ridiculous threat letters that used to be much more common.
Well, we at Fire use the Streisand Effect in describing the downsides of censorship all the time. And we used it even before I was aware that it was you and Techdirt who helped coin it. All you need to do is, you see this in almost every free speech controversy, going back to the Skokie controversy that the ACLU got involved in 1977. Frank Collin, leader of the National Socialist Party of America, was kind of an unknown figure. He had about 10 people that were part of his party in the south side of Chicago. And then they decided to try and branch out into the other suburbs surrounding Chicago, because they had been denied the right to march in Marquette Park, which was right next to their headquarters by the city of Chicago. So they decided they're going to write 12 letters to these suburbs surrounding by Chicago. 11 of them ignored them. But Skokie reacted like a bull to a red flag, and then passed all these ordinances to censor them. And before you know it, the president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, is talking about the Skokie Nazis. And everyone in the United States had probably read about it or seen about it on TV. So what could have been just a gang of 12 idiot Nazis marching through the town of Skokie or demonstrating in the town of Skokie became this cause that everyone in the country knew about. And I also look at what happened, 2017, when Milo Yiannopoulos tried to speak at the University of California, Berkeley in February. And as many listeners to the show will know, there was protests. There were violent protests. The university ultimately decided to not let him speak because they saw that his safety was in danger and the safety of the potential audience was in danger. And what happened an hour after they took Milo Yiannopoulos off the stage? His book went to #1 on Amazon. Right. His book, Dangerous, which was doing pre-sales at that point, became #1 on Amazon, and he was on Tucker Carlson all over Fox News that evening. So that just goes to show that whether you are a government censor or would-be heckler looking to censor, it often backfires, and the message you are looking to mute and in fact gets amplified.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, some people have now said that like a lot of people, and Milo may very well be an example of this, have sort of used their own knowledge of the Streisand Effect, basically to their own advantage, right? I mean, you try and do something in the hope that someone freaks out about it and tries to censor it, and then you just turn that into a publicity campaign. I don't know if that's necessarily true in this case, but certainly there are others who have thought through that process, and there are certain cases where you begin to think like, some of that may have been done on purpose to just try and get attention and do something to try and get someone to shut you down just to get more attention to the original thing.
Oh yeah, no doubt. I I want to move on because I realize we're at 54 minutes already. And I want to talk, perhaps end on defamation lawsuits, because I've been thinking about defamation for a while now. And you recently wrote a post for Techdirt about this person in Canada who is the VP of Finance for the University of Ottawa Students for Free Speech. I think his name is Michele or Michelle or Michael. I don't know exactly.
I don't know how to pronounce it.
DeFranco.
Yes.
I think it's Michele. I'm Italian. His last name is Italian, DeFranco. But he filed a defamation lawsuit against someone who had called him a racist, a bigot, a neo-Nazi, a free speech asshole. And he is part of a growing contingent in Canada of what might be described as, quote, free speech activists who are using the very broad defamation laws in that country to go after their critics. Other people who have filed defamation lawsuits include Jordan Peterson, Gavin McInnes, Lindsay Shepard. Here in the United States, you saw Majid Nawaz file a defamation lawsuit against the SPLC. And I'm looking at these as a free speech advocate, and I'm seeing a lot of times what the lawsuits are being filed over are not so much malicious statements of fact or alleged fact against someone, but rather just someone's interpretation of who someone is. They call someone like Jordan Peterson a fascist. They call someone like DeFranco a bigot. And these people rush to the courthouse gates, and I see some of the defense of these lawsuits on Twitter from these people who are filing them. And they say, well, no true free speech advocate would say that, malicious statements that are untrue about someone is protected under the First Amendment or free speech. And I look at this, I'm saying, well, these are just someone's opinion of who you are based on what you've said. And actually, there's a large contingent of free speech activists in the United States, both now and historically, who have looked at these lawsuits askance and seen that they do, in net, more harm to the cause of free speech and free press than they do to the cause that the people filing them seek to defend, which is that false information about people of fact won't get spread. I think of Justice Hugo Black, who was on the Supreme Court, who did not believe in defamation law. Nat Hentoff, one of the staunchest free speech defenders of the last 100 years, did a debate in the 90s in which he argued against defamation law. And you see a number of publications that while these lawsuits have no chance of winning in the United States, the mere filing of them has bankrupted these organizations. Or you get a scary lawyer letter from someone with a lot of money who could just continue to litigate the lawsuit that they have no chance of winning for years. You still have to pay your attorney's fees in defending them. And this has generated, of course, laws that help protect against that, including the anti-SLAPP lawsuits, the strategic lawsuits against public participation lawsuits. And so this is kind of a long way of me saying that Mr. DeFranco in Canada isn't really on the side of free speech as some free speech activists might be concerned. So I wanted to get your general take on those issues and where you think they stand on the free speech spectrum.
No, I think your description is very accurate, and it's either ironic and funny or sad and depressing, and maybe both of those things, that people who claim to be supportive of free speech end up suing for defamation over speech that is clearly opinions. I am a very, very strong believer in better anti-SLAPP laws. And so for people who aren't familiar with how anti-SLAPP laws work, I mean, they're basically, laws that were originally put in place in response to similar lawsuits that were often done by large developers who were building up buildings or malls or whatever, and people were protesting, and the developers would just sue for defamation over things they knew they couldn't win, but just because, exactly as you said, they knew that the lawsuit alone was enough to silence people and make them cave because it's just so expensive and would bankrupt anyone. So anti-SLAPP laws were put in place in basically right now about half the states in the U.S. Have anti-SLAPP laws that, with varying degrees of, structure allow people to get those cases dismissed very early on, and in the best of cases, also allow you to recover to recover the legal fees, which is an important part of anti-SLAPP laws to discourage these kinds of bogus lawsuits. I think that there can be places for defamation law, though I'm increasingly of the opinion that they should be very, very limited in their ability, just because it is a process that is abused so much and really designed to stifle people's free speech and to just drag people down through legal process. That I think that we live in an age where, when we do have the internet and the ability for more and more people to speak out and give the other side of the story and to counter questionable things. If you don't like someone referring to you as a member of the alt-right or calling you a free speech asshole, whatever that means. Well, the crazy thing I should note in the DeFranco case that you mentioned, he didn't even call him directly a free speech asshole. He had put out a tweet that said, just referring generally to free speech assholes, plural, and linking to a story that included DeFranco in it. So, I mean, it's even more ridiculous than directly calling him a free speech asshole. But like someone calling you an asshole, that is classic free speech. That is someone's opinion, right? You're not going to go to court and define, in concrete factual terms, who is an asshole and who is not, and how do you define that? And one of the classic elements of what is not allowed in a defamation lawsuit is something that cannot be proven true or false. How do you prove that someone is or is not an asshole? I mean, you can have some people, on the stand, and I'm sure, that guy's parents and grandparents would get on the stand and say, no, my child or grandchild is not an asshole. But then you can have anyone else get on the stand and say, no, he's totally an asshole. He cut off in traffic one time. You could, it's such a ridiculous concept of even having to go to court to fight these things. If you're in that situation where someone is saying stuff that you disagree with and that is rude or obnoxious about you, like, respond. Like, you have the ability to say, like, no, you're misinterpreting these things. If I'm, hanging out with these people that you don't like, well, you explain why it is that you're associating with those people, and you give your reasons, and then everyone has the right to their own opinions on whether or not they agree with you or believe you, or if they think you're an asshole or they don't think you're an asshole. Like, that's the nature of open discourse. And the fact that a lot of those people, I mean, in DeFranco's case, the fact that he is, VP of this Students for Free Speech organization is, to me, incredibly hypocritical. It's a situation where, if you really believe in free speech, that has to include people saying negative stuff about you. Right. And it happens, and it's not fun. And I don't like it when people, attack me and my character and say things about me that I don't think is accurate or is based on, misleading take on things. But like, that's going to happen. Not everybody's going to like me. And in fact, a lot of people dislike me. I take strong opinions on a lot of different things, and I recognize that that's going to get people upset. I don't want people upset, and I try and explain myself as carefully as possible. And if somebody's really upset, if I think it's reasonable to do so, I'll try and explain my position better. But that's a case where, more speech tends to be the answer to speech that we don't like. And I'm not going to convince everyone, and some people are still going to be mad. But the fact that you then, are using the fact that you're upset about this stuff to go to court, which is just an incredibly hellish process. And I can't comment more than just making this point on this, but like, I am still in the midst of being sued for defamation myself, and have been dealing with a lawsuit for over 2 years at this point. And it is just an incredible, resource intensive, both in terms of money and time, and and also just energy and mental process of having to deal with, being sued and having to go to court. And it does so much damage, just to people for expressing their opinions on things. And it's really, really intense. And the fact that people are using this, and often people who call themselves free speech supporters are supporting these viewpoints and saying, this is a good thing. This is, we're creating consequences for your speech. That's not what people mean. That's not what real free speech supporters mean when they say speech has consequences. If the consequence is, a questionable lawsuit that is creating all sorts of problems for people just for speaking, and really creating massive chilling effects and silencing people for speaking their opinions, that is not free speech supportive. That is the exact opposite of that.
Yeah, and I won't ask you to comment on it because it's active litigation, but for our listeners who are trying to get an idea of what you were talking about or what you've been going through in the past couple of years, there's someone out there who claims that they invented email, and you all at Techdirt have written about that and commented on it. And this alleged inventor of email has not responded kindly to that. But the whole story is online if any of our listeners want to check that out. Yeah, I mean, this whole use of defamation law is very short-sighted. So I look to Jordan Peterson, who doesn't like being called a racist or a fascist, whatever he was called. He often uses the phrase neo-Marxist extremist or neo-Marxist ideologue to describe his critics. And now some of them might self-describe as neo-Marxist, but in most cases, Jordan Peterson is using that as a pejorative. And someone who doesn't self-identify as a neo-Marxist ideologue might take offense at that, say it's not true, and use the same defamation laws that Jordan Peterson is using to file a lawsuit against him and embroil him in legal battles for nothing more than what is in effect editorializing on someone's views. You might not like them, but so what? That's what you get in living in democracy. So I'm very skeptical of the use of defamation law as a vehicle to shut up your critics and, quote, get the truth out. But there are some cases that are more complicated, and I don't have a strong opinion on this, but there's that kid who was involved in the Covington dispute, the guy in the red MAGA hat who was in front of the Native American man and was seen to be smirking at him, or at least so it seemed, in a 20-second clip that went viral over one weekend. And that kid's life has changed as a result of some newspapers reporting only that 20-second clip, and it later became apparent that there was more to the story than what was in that 20-second clip. But the Washington Post reported on that 20-second clip, and this kid filed a defamation lawsuit for millions of dollars against the Washington Post. And, on the one hand, I feel bad for the kid because his life has changed, and he was alleged to have done something that it's pretty clear he didn't do. He underwent trial by internet, which is never a fun thing. But at the same time, it was a newsworthy story. It was something that people were talking about on the internet, and the Washington Post was reporting on this newsworthy story. Now, you might say good journalism should have demanded that they find the full video clip of what happened over the course of an hour there on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. But we live in a 24-hour news cycle, and people are going to the Washington Post to find information 10 seconds, if not 10 minutes after something happened. So you as an editor have to weigh those things. It's, well, do we talk about what the internet's talking about and assume that the internet is right, or do we wait 24 hours until we can find that longer video and get more context to the story? I mean, there are serious consequences there for both the Washington Post and how we depend on it as a news reporting outlet, but also for the person that's being reported on, the student who looks to have done a very stupid thing in a short 20-second clip, but when you expand it out over the course of an hour, it's less so.
Yeah, I mean, so, there are tough situations.
It gets tough.
I think that the lawsuit that he's filed against the Washington Post has no chance and is going to be dismissed. But I don't either. And it becomes this sort of tricky situation. You look at the specifics of that particular lawsuit, even if you think that the description that originally went around about that young man and everything was inaccurate, which is probably mostly true, though. There's one of these things where a lot of it is in the
well, in that moment he could have been mocking the man. I mean, no one knows what was in his head, and that's an interpretation. And do we really want to prevent news outlets from exercising their editorial judgment and interpreting that moment? I mean, does every interpretation of the news have to happen over the full context of time? I'm not so sure it does.
Right. And I mean, that's an impossible requirement, first of all. It's like the idea that everyone could figure out everything and understand it all is an impossible requirement. And the other thing is that, you look at exactly what happened in this case, and you could say certainly like the initial descriptions and attacks on his character, whether valid or not, completely did change his life. He was effectively an unknown person, and then became a very known person in a very short amount of time. And a lot of that coverage was critical and negative, and that could influence someone. But everything that happened after it sort of shows why defamation law is not necessarily the best tool for this, right? You had that full video come out, and you had, like 16 different viewpoints, because these days everyone is filming everything. And so all of those different viewpoints came out, and there were all of these discussions, and a whole bunch of people who initially said one thing said, wait a second, within about 24 hours, people were saying, oh, I may have been too hasty on this. And there was a big, wide discussion, and it opened up, more discussion and more conversation and more people thinking about these things. And, maybe people were too quick to judge. And that's actually a really good lesson, the lesson that we should encourage people to recognize. Like, sometimes you are too quick to judge. Everyone does that sometimes. And so, but we got that discussion and introspection, and anyone looking at it, now recognizes, they may still have an opinion. They may still think that the kid was being a jerk, and that's a valid opinion to have. Or people could say that everyone else misrepresented the situation. The kid is vindicated, and that's a valid opinion to have. But the internet sort of took care of the situation, right? The supposed harm on him, was minimized within a few days, in terms of the ability of other people to present the other side, and for him to speak out and present his opinions, and for everyone else to opine on it. That opened up this interesting discussion. And you can say that his reputation was harmed, but that depends on, for a lot of people, it wasn't. A lot of people, this kid is now considered, like something of a hero for standing up for his rights. And so, that's the kind of thing that I think we should encourage. The fact that, different people can express their side of their side of view. And it's one of the things that the internet has made especially powerful. Historically, if a major newspaper like the Washington Post presented one side of the story, and you were a high school kid that nobody knew of, your side of the story would never have gotten out historically. But now, because you have all of these other sources, and you have the ability for the kid to go direct and express his opinion, or to go to other media outlets, or to use social media or whatever, his side of the story got out very quickly, and then everyone can kind of weigh the different things and come to their own opinion. And that's what's powerful and good about the internet.
Yeah, one has to wonder, what would have happened to this kid or to anyone else if this story came out in 1980? Now, maybe you wouldn't have, the story would have never been a story, because the power of imagery on the internet is something
Sure.
today that it could have never been at any other time. But let's say that Channel 2 News got that quick 2-second, 3-second snapshot of him and the Native American man confronting each other, and it's editorialized as this student mocking this Native American man and his MAGA hat. It would have ran on the 5 o'clock news, and then it would have been a done deal, because the fallout from that story probably would be less interesting and less newsworthy, for example, than what you saw on the 5 o'clock news in that short 2-minute clip, because you would have never gotten the full hour of video footage released, because the news model at that time, when you only have an hour to show the news of the whole day, wouldn't have supported something like that. And this just kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation about, we're still trying to figure out how to use the internet.
Yep.
We're still trying to figure out how to moderate content. We're still trying to weigh the values of free speech versus other values, such as privacy or creating a community within a private space. And this is just like how we were trying to figure out how to use radio in the early part of the 20th century, or TV in the early part of the 20th century. And hopefully we all learn lessons from some of these controversies that have sprouted up, like the Covington one, and become better users of this multimedia. But I realize we're over an hour now, Mike, and I only asked for an hour of your time. So I just want to thank you again for everything you do at Techdirt and covering free speech and its intersections with technology, and also on occasion things that happen on college campuses, and to keep up the fight. And I hope to do this again soon. Yeah,
this was great. I always love talking about these things. So I enjoyed it, even if we went over time.
Oh, and I should add that you do have a podcast, right?
Yes, we do. We have the Techdirt podcast, and we talk about all different topics. Sometimes we'll do free speech stuff. Sometimes it's basically whatever interesting thing I want to go deep on that particular week, we discuss.
All right. Well, I encourage people to check that out. And Mike, until next time, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was my conversation with Techdirt founder and editor Mike Masnick. It was recorded remotely over the internet on March 11th. You can check out Mike's work by visiting techdirt.com. That is TECHDIRT.com. He's also an entertaining and informative Twitter follow. His handle is mmasnick. That is at MMASNICK. This conversation was hosted, produced, and recorded by me, Nico Perino, and edited by Aaron Reese. To learn more about So to Speak, you can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/freespeechtalk, or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/So to Speak podcast. You can also email us feedback at sotospeak@thefire.org, or call in a question for a future show at 215-315-0100. If you enjoyed this episode, as always, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Google Play. Reviews help us attract new listeners to the show. And until next time, thanks again for listening.